Hello again, students. We're going to continue our look at topic 5, focusing on the changes in the 1920s. Today we're going to look at lesson 3 about the cultural and social changes going on in the United States in this time period. One of the big things we want to kind of look at as far as a framing is the growing rural and urban divide. So there's a lot of change in society and a lot of resistance to that change. And that really exposes this growing divide between the people who live in the cities and those who live in the country. Now, by 1920, the 1920 census is another one of those important censuses, whatever, for us to remember in American history. For the first time in 1920, more Americans lived in cities than outside of cities. And the cities in the 1920s were starting to become the cultural centers of America. They promoted consumerism and emphasis more on formal education, as the jobs there, especially better paying jobs, required more education. The cities were more diverse. A lot of the immigrants from the previous decades had settled in the cities, as well as African Americans from the Great Migration moving into the area. And the cities, by and large, supported this idea of modernism, really an emphasis on the newness, on sort of the changes and the scientific progress of the era. And they, kind of pushed society a little bit, at least in the cities, away from traditional religious beliefs towards a more secular, non-religious society, with an emphasis and a celebration even of scientific progress. By contrast, people who lived in the country, the rural dwellers, were much more resistant to change and much less affected by the changes that were going on in the cities. Many areas in the rural America didn't even have electricity yet, so a lot of those appliances and benefits of the consumer revolution didn't really apply to people out in the countryside. And we also see really in contrast to modernism a rise in fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism in the United States, which emphasized Protestant teachings of Christianity, specifically the idea that the Bible is the literal word for word truth, that everything written in the Bible is to be accepted as literal and not in any way, figurative or allegorical or anything of the sort. The earth was literally created in 6 days. The world was entirely flooded. Those are not stories to tell lessons. Those are literal truths. And nowhere is this more this struggle more played out than in the Scopes trial in Tennessee. John Scopes, a science teacher, was arrested for teaching evolution in school, which was against the law. Now, the trial was sort of a big sensation in the era of radio, and people followed what was going on in there. But in the end, John Scopes was allowed to introduce almost no evidence on his behalf and lost the trial. But it did really sort of emphasize that change, that divide between the rural and urban. And the rural areas tended to be very strongly anti-communist in response to the communist revolution in the Soviet Union, because communism tended to be associated with atheism, and big supporters of temperance. Although when we get into Prohibition, you'll note that folks in the countryside is usually where the illegal liquor was being produced. One of the big changes we're going to see in 1920 society is as a result of the 19th Amendment. Women are going to start to take on a larger role in American society. The 19th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote for women in all states. Women became more of a political force, and some were elected into office. And this kind of leaves the women's movement with a thought of where to go to next. And groups like Alice Paul's National Women's Party started pushing for an equal rights amendment, an amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing equal treatment for men and women. This one will be a long struggle that still has not come to fruition yet. Women's roles in society are starting to change with the idea of what they call the new woman. Everything is referred to as new in many ways in the 1920s, emphasizing this modernism. And they challenged political, economic, social, and educational boundaries. As you know, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, many, particularly young women in the cities, started to assume, political and social equality with men. You can see the changes in fashion from just maybe 10 years. The woman on the right from the 1920s compared to the more Victorian style worn by the woman on the left maybe 10 years prior to this. The consumer revolution and the household appliances had meant, many women were still in the traditional household role, but it made housework much easier and provided more free time. The new woman married later, had fewer children. Remember Margaret Sanger and birth control. And were able to enlarge their intellectual world by having more free time for education, book clubs, and so on and so forth. The iconic view of women is the young woman in the 1920s, the flapper style, much looser, more practical kind of fancy clothing that these girls would wear when going out on the town, and also representative of a much more out in society role that women were a part of. Now, this changing role for women, as I kind of hinted at, is really more of a change for women in the cities. Women in the rural areas saw much less of this change. African American migration and the prominence of their own culture came to alter American culture as well. The previously mentioned Great Migration of African Americans away from the Jim Crow laws and violence of the South to the cities where there was more job opportunities in the North, particularly spiked during World War I. After World War I, of course, most of those families remained in those cities, and that's going to change the demographics and culture of the cities, as well as the politics and economic and educational opportunities for African Americans were generally greater in the northern cities. By no means equal, though. Racism and tensions over competition for jobs, particularly after World War I, when many of the soldiers returned home and the demand for products decreased and the price controls of the government went away. There was a lot of tension between African Americans and whites living in the North, and we'll see a series of race riots and massacres in the early part of the 1920s that will also continue throughout much of the history there. There was also a movement from a guy named Marcus Garvey towards what was kind of referred to as black nationalism, taking the idea of the ethnic nationalism of the 20th century and applying it to people of African descent. He believed in sort of a Pan-Africanism, a shared common identity for all these people whose ancestors were African and kind of got spread throughout the globe through slavery and whatever. And he created something called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, that promoted a separation of African Americans from white society and a promotion of their own communities and businesses. Jazz, a traditionally African American music or born from African American rhythms, as well as the push for improvisation, became the music of the decade. It was, considered to be fast, free, rebellious, and fun, very much like the 1920s are often depicted as. It was played in the speakeasies and clubs, usually by African American musicians like the one seen in this picture, to sometimes all white audiences. But the popularity of the music is going to cross racial lines and into the mainstream and become part of U.S. mass culture. And this is also somewhat related to the Harlem Renaissance, which is a flowering of African American culture and literature in the 1920s, centered in Harlem, New York. It celebrated black culture as well as explored questions of race and what it means to be a black person in American society. And it helped to sort of create a shared sense of group identity among African Americans, less of a regional identity, that sort of mass culture thing we were seeing with the country overall. There was sort of more of a shared identity of what it means to be an African American. One of the most iconic changes of the 1920s, and really one of the best examples of the rural-urban divide, is going to be Prohibition. In 1919, sort of as the culmination of the efforts of many progressives, particularly within the temperance movement, the United States will ratify the 18th Amendment, banning the sale and distribution of alcohol in the United States. And fairly quickly after that, Congress will pass the Volstead Act, which is the law that actually enforces prohibition. The people who supported prohibition were often referred to as dries, and they were mostly rural, socially traditional, and religiously fundamentalist. They saw alcoholism as a major problem in the 1920s, and it really was. It was much more widespread. Liver disease was a big problem, a health problem, and of course there's all the social problems caused by the disruption of the family and work. And Dry saw prohibition as a way to improve the individual, but as well as strengthening the family and society as a whole. And many companies supported prohibition because they saw alcoholism as interfering with production, as it led to missed time or inefficiencies at work for the workers who drank too much. Nativists, including the Ku Klux Klan, supported prohibition because they associated alcohol and drinking with immigrants. The people who opposed it were referred to as wets, and they were usually urban, secular, and modernist. And they believed that prohibition would not stop drinking and would actually create an atmosphere of hypocrisy, as people were almost encouraged to flout the law. And so the law, they said, would take on less of a force in America when you outlaw something like drinking that would be very widely ignored, particularly in the cities, as we can see in this picture here. Eventually, though, in 1933, prohibition will be repealed by the 21st Amendment. It was considered impossible to enforce. It led to a rise in organized crime as the mafia and other groups became the distributors of this illegal liquor and became very, very wealthy off of it. And also, by this point, we were in the Great Depression, and the government needed tax money. And taxing alcohol was one way to make money. On the plus side, though, prohibition, at least early on, really did see a sharp decrease in the amount of drinking in America, as well as the associated health problems such as liver disease. Lastly, I'll just touch on how the changes in technology and society affected art and literature in America. The uncertainty after World War I led to a lot more pessimistic literature and questionings of the ideas of progress and what the American dream was, the so-called lost generation of writers who wrote in the post-World War I period, very disillusioned by what had occurred there. European influences made their way into American art. Art became more abstract. This particular painting from Jacob Lewis's Migration series shows a much less representative, a little bit more abstract depiction of African Americans in the Great Migration. And more towards the expressive movement. Mass media, through the radio in particular, will give rise to celebrity culture. People like Charles Lindbergh, an aviator who flew a solo flight across the Atlantic, or Babe Ruth, a baseball player, started to become famous for being famous. Take a look at the graphic organizer for Lesson 3. The top part just has a list of some of the movements from the 1920s. I ask you to explain what it is and how it changed American society. And the bottom has a series of questions relating to the development of prohibition. So if we look closely at modernism here, we see it defined as a movement that broke with convention, emphasizing science and progress, and the way it changed society by making it less religious and more secular. 我你再见。